Good morning, everyone. It's a delight for me to be here with you. Although I must confess, I had only 2 hours sleep last night. And the reason is because on the way here from San Francisco, I forgot my laptop at the security check. And I was hoping to work on my slides in the 16-hour flight for San Francisco. And unfortunately, it didn't happen. So I wrote a book on Jugaad, right? So I have to practice it now. So I ended up actually staying at India International Center, and luckily they had a desktop there, so I was able to spend, until the wee hours in the morning to finish this presentation. So I hope that while I try to stay awake, hopefully my content won't put you to sleep. You had some good, strong tea, hopefully, to keep you awake. So it's interesting because I was born and raised in Pondicherry, left Pondicherry when I was 19 in 1989. And I was lucky to return to India about 17 years ago when I was vice president at Forrester Research, which is a leading technology research firm. And I remember coming probably in this room and discussing a lot about disruption, but from a technology perspective. So 17 years later, it's kind of interesting. We get older, we mature, and maybe we become wiser. Today, I want to discuss about something else, which is to kind of have you think for a few seconds before we go further, this important question. Assuming we are entering the age of disruption, that is going to happen. It's already happening. Fine. It's taken for a given now. How are we going to deal as HR leaders, right? I'm putting myself in your shoes. How are you going to deal with this disruption? And I think there are two approaches. There is a smart approach, and there is a wise approach. Of course, if I were standing in Silicon Valley where I live, I ask this question to HR leaders there, they will say, of course, we need to address this disruption smartly, because it's all about smartness, right, in Silicon Valley. And it is true because in the Western societies and increasingly in developing countries like India, smartness and particularly intelligence sells well. We heard about marketing, right? So anything smart packaged as a marketing slogan sells well, whether it's smartphones. We carry smartphones. We will be wearing soon smart clothes with nanomaterials. We have smart appliances at home, like smart fridges that talk to us, smartphones. We have also smart homes now, like smart buildings. And then everybody's obsessed now about building smart cities. And not only that, it goes even further, because if you read the book by Yuval Harari, who wrote the famous book, Sapiens. This is his newest book, which has already sold several million copies in the world, which is Homo Deus, which is man's attempt to become God. And his interpretation of God is the ultimate mind, the super smart, or as Aurobindo calls, the super mind. And what he's saying is that essentially, we are not smart enough. And the rich people in the future will be able to use embed technologies literally in the brain to augment the intelligence. We call it augmented intelligence. And therefore, he says in the future, there's going to be a different kind of inequality between the augmented haves and augmented not haves. And the augmented haves will be able to use these technologies to enhance the cognitive capabilities, the creative capabilities of our children, will therefore be able to excel in school and therefore have a better career path compared to others who can afford to have these technologies that augment human intelligence. So smartness is actually glorified in most modern societies. And we also believe that smart entrepreneurs are the prototypical disruptors. In Silicon Valley, this is the term that we love, right? I want to be a disruptor. And of course, we admire disruptors like Steve Jobs, of course, who has disrupted again and again many sectors with different products. Elon Musk with electric car, of course, disrupting the transportation sector. But I want to kind of share with you this little kind of a secret, is that it turns out that actually smartness doesn't always give you what you want. And as a matter of fact, sometimes smartness or intelligence cannot always take you where you want to go. Rather, it can take you to the wrong places, like to jail, which is what happened to Rajat Gupta. He topped his IIT Delhi here class, became, I believe, a Baker Scholar, which is summa cum laude from Harvard Business School, youngest to graduate from there. and then he ended up serving 2 years in jail because he was smart, but he was unwise in other dimensions. So the danger is that sometimes smartness can lead to disrepute. That's why I say that smart disruptors sometimes can be unwise disreputers. Same thing happened with Jeff Skelling, another Baker scholar from Harvard Business School, became the CEO of Enron. You remember that company? I still remember the 90s because they were glorified. World Economic Forum, my own company, Forest Research. We admire this company because, wow, here's an asset-light energy company that delivers energy without owning any assets. Well, he ended up actually in jail as well, right? Because realized that actually Enron is just a financial house of cards. It collapsed. And this also applies to a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. You may have heard about Elizabeth Holmes. She's actually a Stanford dropout. And she dropped out so she can start this company called Theranos. And the promise of Theranos is that with a tiny, tiny droplet of blood, they can run a battery, an area of test for a fraction of the cost that is charged today by clinics. And it turns out that it's all bogus. At the heydays, this company was valued $9 billion. Overnight, when the FDA revealed that this device is not effective, she was worth nothing. So instead of rags to riches, she went from riches to rags. Okay? So again, smart person, but unwise. So what is then smartness, or what we call intelligence? Smartness is the faculty that helps us differentiate from others and win the race. That means that it's all about me versus you and who's going to win the race. So the motivation underlying, the energy, if you like, that serves intelligence is competition. And therefore, it's all about self-interest. And there are limitations of smartness that we're beginning to finally realize today in today's, I would say, increasingly what we call the VUCA world, which is essentially volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, but also an increasingly globally interdependent global economy. So let me kind of walk you to some of the limitations of smartness. First is that you can be smart today, but not tomorrow. Why? Because the context, and that's a key word, the context keeps changing. So the best practices of yesterday become obsolete practices by tomorrow. The second limitation of smartness is that it's always anchored, as I said, in the past or in the future. And we'll go more in details in coming slides. Because the smart leaders, there are two categories, are either driving the car looking the rear view or driving the car looking to the binoculars. And therefore, they miss what's right in front of the car. Okay? They have a big accident sometime or get injured because they are not anchored in the present moment where the reality unfolds. The third limitation is that in an increasingly globalized economy, what is smart for one group of people here in this group in Delhi may appear totally inappropriate for a group of leaders in Japan or in London. So the cultural context has to be factored in and be able to modulate intelligence according to the cultural context, which often is hard for leaders. The fourth one, and I'm doing a lot of research for my next book on this. I'm applying it to myself because I'm actually a victim of this. Smart people, we think we are good at spotting patterns. That is, I can connect the dots before anyone else. Well, it turns out in neurosciences that ability to connect the pattern, actually it's not identifying pattern, is actually coming from the limbic system, which is the primal part of the brain, which is the reptilian, is the first one, and then there's the second level, which is limbic. A limbic system is all about pattern. It says threat, opportunity. That's all it matters. And what it does is that when he sees a recurring pattern, something that happened in the past, it says, wow, this is it. Either run away from this danger or go for this opportunity, right? Sometimes it works. By luck, it works. But if you repeat it over time in a time series, you will realize that you'll make more mistakes by following these patterns and make strategic blunders than sometimes restraining yourself from doing so. So all this means that smartness can become very quickly an addiction unless it's anchored in wisdom. And that is going to be, in a nutshell, the takeaway from what's coming in the next few slides. So there are as we studied, me and my co-author, Dr. Prasad Kaipa, who's the CEO coach, we actually looked at, what are the different kinds of smartness that exist out there. And roughly, we realized that there is like a continuum, like a spectrum, if you like, of smartness. And there are kind of two poles, or two kind of categories or kinds of smartness. There are the leaders who are what we call functional smart. They excel in operations. They have an incredible depth of expertise. But they're also traditional. They value the traditions of the organizations, not because they think change is bad. It's just that certain things in their organization they believe have value and have to be cherished and maintained. They're excellent execution and really focus on bottom line. But they're also sometimes too cautious, and they don't take a reckless kind of a risk. And then there is this other category of smart people that we call business smart. They are much more entrepreneurial, like Steve Jobs. They are much broad in their thinking because they try to connect dots. We heard about taking innovation from one sector, like X-ray devices. GE is doing it, right? X-ray devices applied to inspect oil and gas pipeline. So they always think about how can we connect dots across disciplines and functions. They're always visionary. They can see things ahead of anyone else. Always focus on top-line growth, and sometimes very bold and sometimes reckless kind of risk taker as well. So just kind of take a few seconds to look at this definition and look at where do you fit in this kind of categorization. Are you more a functional smart leader, or are you more a business smart leader? Most of you may be like a hybrid. But what we found is that over time, even though you may be kind of fluctuating between these two kinds of smartness, over time, because of your gunas, as we say in India, your predisposition, your proclivity, your svabhana, which is your inner nature, or the cultural context of the company, over time, you end up being more often than not thinking and acting as a functional smart leader as opposed to or being a business smart leader. So in most companies, of course, thankfully, there is a balance. India, right, is always about balance, not about polarization. So you need to have a balance because both types of smartnesses are important. So if you look at, for example, when Apple had Steve Jobs until 2011, Steve Jobs was the quintessential red leader, as we call it, which is the business smart, right? Very visionary, very entrepreneurial, very bold risk taker. But he was tempered in his redness, because red is fire, right? Fire element, Agni. He was tempered by the grounding earth element, Prithvi, which was actually the blue leader, which was Tim Cook. Tim was fantastic in operational excellence. He was head of supply chain, so he can deliver things on time under budget. So this combination between a functional smart and a business smart leader was fantastic because Steve Jobs can conceptualize a lot of stuff, and then Tim Cook it was Shiva Shakti, right? A lot of conceptualization, and then Tim Cook could manifest it, make it a reality. And of course, now Steve Jobs isn't there. So I leave you the question mark, what's going to happen to this visionary company in the next 5, 10 years, to be seen. Now, what we notice actually is that we are not passing a judgment, right, in terms of whether functional smart is better than business smart. Actually, what we are saying is that it's important in an increasingly complex world to be able to embrace this full continuum of smartness, which is being able to fluctuate to intelligence so that there are times when it's important to think and act more in a functional smart mode, and there are times where it's more important to think and act more in a business smart mode. But often, as I said, because we tend to the pendulum gets stuck in either side, so leaders we observe and study tend to become either too much functional or too much business smart. So what allows you to unstuck and start dancing and fluctuating is when you're anchored in wisdom. So wisdom is actually about transcending and including these two categories of smartness. And when you do that very well, you start practicing what we call wise leadership. So wise leadership, before I introduce in more depth the definition of this concept, it's actually about embracing smartness and adding two more dimensions. I studied computer science in the 90s, and at that time, we were transitioning, and Anita knows very well, probably, we're transitioning from the C language, which is a procedural language, to something called C++, which is object-oriented language. And that was an incredible paradigm shift, because object orientation allows you to have a higher level of abstraction compared to the C language. And same way, if you think about smartness as S, the letter, wisdom is S++. It's still about intelligence, but adding 2 more qualities to it. The first plus is self-awareness. Know thyself as a leader. And the second plus is contextual awareness. What's happening around you? So the inner knowledge and the outer knowledge, when enriched with intelligence, becomes very powerful. And that's a nutshell, right? That's what wisdom is. It's about smart plus plus. So in our book, actually, we go more in depth. Shameless plug-in, my book is up for sale outside, so maybe sometime this afternoon you can grab a coffee if you like. And we kind of use this allegory, right, of the turtle and the hare to kind of imply that actually, there is a time to act more like a hare, and there are times when it's better to be more like, the turtle. So let me kind of then go more into the formal definition of what we mean by wise leadership. Wise leadership is the application of intelligence to serve the common good, or what we call a noble cause. Now, last night I was debating whether I should call it the greater good or the common good. And we'll come to that later, because I think that for my generation X, doing the right thing for society and the planet, we called it the greater good compared to the average good. But I heard the question from some of the students today. I think that the next generation, for millennials and Gen Z, the social and ecological responsibility becomes the normal thing for them. And that's why I say this is the common good. Okay? What used to be greater good for us is going to become the common good. So it's about applying intelligence not to serve yourself in a selfish way, but serve others. It's also about balancing action, because in Silicon Valley it's about, go, 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 go. I just like American movies, because there's always a scene where they say, go, 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 go. Right? I don't know where they're going, but they have to go somewhere. Right? It's always about action. Right? But sometimes it's good to restrain yourself from action, to give yourself the time for reflection and introspection. So introspection is much more inward, and reflection is about what happened. Let's say that there was a failure in the project, right? Reflect on it. Try to derive lessons from it. And introspect on what role you played in it and how you can become a better person. So it's focusing on perfectibility, not perfection. And then it's about repositioning smart leadership in the present moment, here and now. And today we have a fancy word for it. We call it mindfulness, which I hate because it's more than the mind, as you know. But that's how it's called in English now. It's really about connecting with the present moment, because reality unfolds in the present moment, because the past is history and the future is an illusion, right? So present is the only reality. This is where we live. So leadership has to be anchored in the present moment. And then it's about leveraging the 3 other qualities that go with wisdom, which is ethical clarity. It's about discernment, which is the real definition of buddhi, by the way, which is often translated by intellect. But buddhi is really about the laser-sharp discernment. And then humility as well, which is a key attribute of wise leadership. And we have actually set up this website. You can go check out, 6capabilities.com. It's a self-assessment that you can use for yourself as HR leaders and share with your employees as well to find out, what are the capabilities where they demonstrate more smartness as opposed to, wisdom. And I will go deeper into the 6 capabilities, in the next slides. But before I go there, I want to define wisdom, because one of the reasons I think that wisdom got a bad rap, especially in India, which is the birthplace of a lot of wisdom traditions, right? Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism, etc., is because we often confuse wisdom, or we have a skewed view of wisdom as being about spiritual wisdom. The monks who live, somewhere in a monastery, or the yogis who live, in Himalayas, right? So that kind of spiritual wisdom, the Greeks called it Sophia. Basically, you are withdrawing yourself from society and from action to become, much more an inner seeker. But there is another type of wisdom that the Greeks valued more. It's called phronesis, which is practical wisdom. how can I be wise in day-to-day activities as a spouse, as a father, as a teacher, as a leader, as a politician, right? So that kind of practical aspect of wisdom is what we'll talk about today. So me and my co-author, actually, we studied a lot of wisdom traditions, and including the Bhagavad Gita. And we tried to extract what are some of the 6 kind of quintessential capabilities of wise leaders. And we identified these 6 that I want to delve into with some examples. The first one is about the most important is connecting to a noble purpose, which we call a transcendental purpose, something which is larger than yourself. And that is really what will give you meaning and kind of in your life. And the second one is acting authentically and appropriately. And I realize that maybe I will go into detail as I go into the examples in a minute. Let me just then list them. So if you have acting authentically and appropriately, and by the way, that's the toughest one for me to practice. I'll explain why later. Because in the West, it's all about be yourself, right? Be authentic. I will explain later that that's a disastrous advice. Because sometimes you have to be appropriate as well. So it's about balancing authenticity with appropriateness. It's about leading from any position. Leader know how to lead from the front, middle, or from the back. And deciding with discernment, combining instincts, emotions, feelings, and logic, and intuition. It's about demonstrating what we call flexible fortitude, knowing when to hold, when to let go. And then finally, acting with not selfishness nor selflessness, but what we call enlightened self-interest. So let me kind of go into more details into each of these capabilities. The first one is, as I said, connecting to a noble purpose. And when you connect to noble purpose, something very important happens, is that your perspective, your drishti, your gaze changes. Instead of being this way, you have a much broader perspective suddenly. And that's the power of connecting to noble purpose. And my good friend, V.R. Feroz, who was appointed, as many of you know, the youngest MD of SAP Labs several years ago in Bangalore, rose to the ranks and today is the SVP of Globalization Services at SAP, based in Palo Alto in California. And he has a son who is in the autism spectrum. And of course, he kept that private for a long time. And it wasn't easy for him to raise, for him and his spouse to raise this kid. And today is 11, that kid. And at one point in his life, realized that actually this private matter can become something that he can channel his energies to make it a public cause that he can support. And so he was the first at SAP Labs India to actually recruit young people with autism to be employed as programmers. Because it turns out that autistic people have an unbelievable ability to focus. They can do things like testing, software testing, in 4 or 5 hours that takes average person 8 hours. Okay? So what we consider as a disability actually is a different ability, right? So that's what Feroz realized, is that they are not disabled people, they're differently abled people. It's just that we need to adapt to their needs as opposed to expecting them to adapt to our needs. So he did that successfully at SAP India. And based on the success, SAP, as a global company, committed itself to having 1% of the global workforce by 2020 made up of people in the autism spectrum. Okay, 1%, which is quite impressive, right? And he isn't stopping there, right? He's now becoming an activist for improving the rights of the differently abled people in India, particularly, where this is seen as there's a stigma, right, assigned to people with different abilities. And he has been championing this India Inclusion Summit, right, which happens a few weeks ago, I believe, in Bangalore, to actually showcase that these people have different abilities. These are artists. There are painters who paint with their feet because they don't have hands, et cetera, et cetera. So he's creating like a World Economic Forum, for the differently abled people, which I think is admirable. And so what happens is that once he found this noble purpose, as you can see, his perspective shifted. He's no longer just the SVP of a large multinational company, and he's probably now on track to go even further up there in the hierarchy of the company. But he's now becoming a spokesperson right? And kind of advocate for, defending the kind of basic rights of differently abled people, particularly in his home country, India. Why this is important to connect with the purpose? Because every time I come to India in the last 17 years, I'm just baffled by when I ask, companies like, what's your purpose? Well, we want to be the best. We want to provide the best customer service in the industry. Well, that is kind of the what, right? Or somebody that will say, well, our goal is by 2020, we want to be the largest, company in our sector. That is just a vision. So far, you're just addressing the what and the how. But you're not addressing the why question, which is answered only when you find the purpose. And I would argue that the next generation of employees you'll be dealing with or trying to recruit, the Gen Y and Z, are more and more interested in your answer to the why question, and they're less interested in how you are showcasing your what and your how. Okay? So that's why it's very important to not just connect with the purpose, but make it kind of the cornerstone of your talent attraction and retention strategy. The second capability is to be able to, as I said, act both authentically and appropriately. And be aware, as I call, of your action orientation. And here I want to illustrate that with somebody I admire a lot. She's a clothing designer, and she's also the CEO of this apparel company called Eileen Fisher. Maybe not known in India, but in America, women love her clothes. Very simple, very elegant, and extremely durable. Extremely durable. Now, what she's trying to do is she's trying to go against, that's why, right, it's not appropriate, against what the industry does, which is fast fashion. So she's going for another concept called slow fashion. So instead of introducing, dozens of, different designs every year, she introduces only 2-3 seasons a year. And the clothes she designs are designed with, durable materials so that you can keep them long enough that you don't have to keep replacing them. They can be mixed and matched, so you don't have to worry about. So basically, you have more for less in a way. But that's the, the economic side. But now I'm going to go to the social ecological side. It gets more interesting. This is the first apparel company that I know has committed that by 2020, all the materials will be sustainably sourced, no chemical dyes, okay? Only organic materials. And they are working with all the suppliers in the value chain. Several of them are in China and India, so that they can reduce significantly use of water, which is a big problem in coming years. And they have to put a lot of their own money to upgrade the capabilities of the suppliers so they can actually increase their sustainability standards. And it's the only company in the world I know set up 20 years ago a Department of Social Consciousness. The Department of Social Consciousness. And what they do is essentially, somebody asked a question about social consciousness, right? Some young people. So this company, what they do is that, and they are featured in my next book, I'm working on Conscious Society, because they are saying that it's not just enough that we feel responsible for what we do within our four walls, because we have to go all the way upstream to the cotton farmers, make sure that whatever is happening at that level is socially and ecologically responsible. And then also downstream, right, with the contract manufacturers and the sewers they work with, like in India and China. So what they do is actually they work with all the families and people who actually, the suppliers in India and China, to give them loans for education of the children. They continually upgrade their skill set. And in India, they're doing something more interesting, which is what I call cultural sustainability. They're working with some of the tribal people who have very unique weaving skills. And as you know, they're dying. And the idea is essentially to help them preserve those skills and find a way to integrate these very little suppliers into the global value chain. Okay? And of course, it's interesting because she has been doing it quietly for about 10 years. Why quietly? Because she felt it's the authentic thing to do, because she's an introvert. As an introvert, she didn't want to go publicly talk about it. And she realized that actually it's not enough to just do quietly things, because the rest of the industry is business as usual, right, in the apparel sector. So she's decided to become a militant activist, which goes against her own personality, a guna, right, which is being more introvert. But she says, it's okay. Being shy doesn't stop me from speaking publicly about what I believe in. So she, in the last couple of months alone, she's becoming more publicly visible now, going for this because I don't know if you know that, but actually, if my memory serves well, it's the apparel industry is one of the most polluting industries in the world. It's one of the largest that's contributing to the climate change. We don't realize that. So if there's one sector that can really help overcome climate change, is a sector, but things are not moving fast enough. So now that she has walked the walk, she's willing now to talk the walk. Okay? So this is how she's learning to balance authenticity and what's appropriate not only for her value chain, but for the whole society as a whole by speaking publicly. Next comes role clarity. That is, when is it appropriate to lead from the front? Because we always think the leader is like the one in front. But there are times when it's important to be in the middle and sometimes important to be all the way in the back and help others be in the limelight. And I think many of you know this example, but I think Abdul Kalam, in a way, was very fond of mentioning this example, right, of his former boss, Satish Dhawan, who was the former ISRO chairman. And the story goes that when they were trying this space mission, the first trial failed. So when there was a press conference. At the press conference, Dr. Dhawan actually was present. He said, the buck stops here with me. I'm responsible for this failure. And then the second trial succeeded under the leadership of Kalam. There was another press conference. Dr. Dhawan doesn't show up. He said, Kalam, you have to go and take credit for it. That's what leaders do, right? But unfortunately, what happens is when things fail, leaders blame others. And when things succeed, they want to take credit, right? And the second thing about being a wise leader, as I said, is there are multipliers. This is a concept that my colleague Liz Wiseman, you should invite her for next year's conference. She's a terrific, she was the head of Oracle, the software company, university, so head of the leadership programs, HR person. And she wrote this fabulous book called Multipliers. That means that a smart leader is all about showcasing my intelligence. Look at how smart I am, like a Superman. A wise leader sees the potential in their subordinates. They see they can become potentially Superman themselves or Supergirls. And they try to make sure that they can amplify the intelligence of others, hence the term multipliers, right? As opposed to diminishers or dampeners, if you like. Now, the next capability is clarifying decision logic. This is extremely important because, and by the way, in a few minutes, I promise I will connect the dots with the theme of today, which is disruption, but I'm just warming you up for what's coming next, which is going to be disruptive itself, what I'm going to say next. But one of the problems with disruption is that there's a lot of fear-mongering goes, right? Because, oh my God, you'll be disrupted. I remember in the 90s, it was, you'll be Amazon. Remember that? Like, every 10 years, every decade, there's a new term, right? Before it was, you'll be Amazoned with e-commerce. Now it'll be Uberized, by people like Uber, right? So what happens is that when you hear all this nonsense, your emotions get, overactive, right? And letting emotions, and as I said, the limbic system, take, strategic decisions could be dangerous. So when the external context becomes more and more murky, more and more turbulent, you need to pay attention to what is the energy that drives your, what we call decision logic. And that means more self-awareness to know, am I taking decision because my emotions are telling me this? Or is it my intelligence, my prefrontal cortex after reflection and telling me this? Or is it my intuition after introspection which is telling me this? And we'll come to that in a minute, some of the simple tools to use to find out among these three inputs what is the most dominant. But the point is that you need a mix of all three, right, to be a good leader. So one example here I thought illustrates very well this balancing act between intuition, emotion, intelligence is Merkel, Chancellor Merkel from Germany. And as you know, she's a chemist, I believe biologist, so scientist by training, very logical, very rational, super smart. But she's also a woman, very empathetic, and also very intuitive. And when she made a decision, as you know, several years ago, to welcome refugees, it didn't go well within her own party. because they felt that it's going to actually fuel the rise of the far-right party, which turns out to be true in the recent elections. But she felt that, again, she was empathetic to, first of all, to these women who have to flee these very harsh conditions with little babies to find the promised land in Germany so they can build a better future for their children. So there was empathy, of course, but there was also this rational, pure core logic which was involved, because she knew that by 2020, 50% of the industrial workforce in Germany will be retiring. Germany is aging at an alarming speed. And so they need refugees to refresh the demographic growth, population growth. And that's why they welcomed over 2 million refugees, right? Which is incredible. I'm a French citizen, and we always pride in France of being the land of asylum seekers. But in reality, we only welcome a few thousand refugees. They welcomed 2+ million refugees. Can you imagine that, right? And this decision today, she paid a harsh price, right? Because they didn't do well in the recent general elections. But I think history, in hindsight, will judge her as being a wise leader. And that's the other thing. When a wise leader makes a decision, it's very counterintuitive. They may not be approved by the media, by your own party, but it's only in Insight 2020, later on, you realize, like, wow, what a wise person they are. And this means something important, we'll come to that later, is that if you are too much a smart leader, driven by ego, you'll be so much craving for validation, approval from polls, from employees, et cetera, that will decide, drive your decision, right? And sometimes you won't take unpopular decisions because you want to play it safe. Or you'll be like, which way the wind blows? Oh, let's go that way, right? So as opposed to really connecting your own intuition, and when you manifest what the intuition tells you to do, it may not be popular in your own surroundings. But again, you're doing what is right because you're connected to a noble purpose. And that's what gives you that moral courage to pursue what seems right. And the next capability of wise leadership is about developing what I call flexible fortitude. This is about knowing when and what to hold and when and what to let go. And because this is a lot of problem, right, especially for functional smart people, because they are holding on to the status quo. And in an age of disruption, right, you have to let go, right? And but conversely, sometimes the business smart people like disruption. Let's disrupt everything, reinvent everything, right? And we do that all the time. That's also dangerous because in the process, you may be throwing the baby with the bathwater. And one company, I think, has done a relatively good job in handling this kind of balancing act between what to keep, what to let go, has been General Electric under the leadership of, until recently, Jeff Immelt was a CEO for, I think, almost like 12, 15 years at GE. And he realized, as you know, when he inherited the company from Jack Welch, was the Jack Neutrino, of course, it was a hodgepodge of a lot of stuff. Not much coherence with the roots of the company, which is industrial roots. So he let go gradually of a lot of businesses, and more recently, the financial unit, I think they sold it off as well. And, but they realized that it's not just about letting go, it's also about what do we keep. And here there was a dilemma at the time, a couple of years ago, because they heard about the disruption coming from Silicon Valley, and they realized that in 10 years, the real competition for General Electric will not be Siemens or Schneider Electric, other industrial firms, but will be the GAFA, Google, Apple, Facebook, Amazon, because with the Internet of Things, as more industrial objects get connected, these Silicon Valley players can actually use the data to offer valued services to GE's industrial customers. So they realized that they need to learn something from Silicon Valley without necessarily losing the industrial roots. And this is where they brought in Beth Comstock, who today is the number 2 in the company, the first woman to become a vice chair at General Electric. And she is actually fantastic in combining the Silicon Valley ethos, the entrepreneurial spirit of Silicon Valley, with the respect for the tradition that GE represents, as represented, the industrial tradition of the company. And that's why they renamed themselves as the Industrial Internet Company. They didn't drop the term industrial. And that was very interesting when she's a good friend of mine, and when I interviewed her for my recent book, she said, at the beginning, we felt that we should become like a Silicon Valley company, right? And then we realized that actually even the Silicon Valley companies, the startups, for example, that she works with often, want to partner with us because of our industrial assets and our access to these amazing markets, these 100-year-old experience we have in scaling up our products, right? So we don't want to get rid of those things, right? That's what attracts talent. Of course, that means that we need to, again, selectively unlearn, forget certain things that don't work for us, like Six Sigma and certain kind of, very, very kind of convoluted processes they had in place, and they embrace something called lean startup, which is an approach to kind of, develop products and put them in the marketplace very quickly, like Silicon Valley startups do. So they embrace this kind of, lean startup ethos, but at the same time, they remain authentic to the industrial roots. So that is what I'm getting at, is that be very careful with the age of disruption, because the tendency is to totally disrupt everything. So you need to have the discernment, again, to know what is worth keeping and what is worth letting go. In other words, what can you unlearn and what do you need to learn and relearn. And then the last but not least capability of wise leadership is about understanding what is your motivation, what is your drive. And as I said, smart leaders often tend to be driven by self-interest. And selflessness for a corporate leader, not only is not practical, but also I think that it doesn't make much sense, because when you're especially a private company, right, you still have to deliver value to the the shareholders. But it's about broadening the focus beyond, right, broadening the perspective, right. It's about broadening beyond shareholders and think about stakeholders. And the shareholders are a subset. They're not excluded. They are now part of a larger set of stakeholders. And that means that you learn to act with what we call enlightened self-interest. That means that by helping others, you're helping yourself. So in American English, we have this expression called the rising tide lifts all boats. So it's no longer about your boat. You're trying to rise, all boats, there. And I think here a good example is Paul Polman, the CEO of Unilever. In India, it's Hindustan Lever, HUL. And they made a big, bold plan in 2010 that by 2020, over a 10-year period, they want to double the revenues from $40 billion to $80 billion, while at the same time reducing the ecological impact by 50%. That is essentially do more and better with less. And they're almost nearing the completion of this program. And before I go any further, this is a very interesting case study for HR leaders, because it's interesting that when they started this, right, they realized that this is important because there was an economic, motivation, saving resources, right, makes sense. There is an impact on society, and which is good as well in terms of the image, of course, the CSR angle. But they didn't realize that there is a bigger benefit, which is the HR benefit, which is the fact that they are now ranked the third most attractive employer by young people after Google and Apple, because of what they're doing in the ecological space. Okay? So it's becoming now a talent magnet, right? Because of this focus on doing the right thing for the society and planet, because they also want to deliver, as you know, clean water and sanitation services to about 1 billion people by 2020 as well. And there's one more thing they're doing, which I think is quite fascinating, as an evidence of this enlightened self-interest. They are now sharing, as open source, some of the technologies they're developing to reduce the carbon footprint. So for example, this is a technology that allows them to reduce the amount of aluminum and emissions from the deodorant cans by 50%. And so it's the same performance, but at the same time, using less aluminum and less, CO2 emissions. And after having an exclusivity of a year or two, they made it open source so that other companies can take this technology and build their own products. So I think this is something that, enlightened self-interest do. And Nanita, I may be wrong, but I think now I remember in my book we talked about also, I think Narayana Murthy did that as well in Infosys when he shared the CMM level 5 certification process, right? When Infosys, and that's an interesting case study because at that time, right, I mean, Infosys and Mr. Narayana Murthy idea was that actually the whole India has to be in the radar of multinationals. right? Because India was as a region, right? For people like GE to attract them to India so that they can begin to, outsource and offshore a lot of the IT services here in India. And so when I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but when I think Infosys got CMM level 5 certified, and I think you shared that process with publicly, right? Again, rising tide lifts all boats. Because once the MNCs come to India, then we can compete, right? But if you're not even coming to India, it doesn't make any sense, right, to protect and hoard, any kind of IP, right? So that's really what enlightened self-interest is about, right? By helping others, we help ourselves as well. Now, let me wrap up by going now. So far I shared the 6 capabilities, right, about wise leadership. You can, apply them, of course, to yourself, HR leaders. But also what I want to do is talk about a typically Western concept, okay? Why is it Western? Because this is based and rooted in a Western view of notion of time. Time in the Western mindset is linear, sequential, unitary. And this is mirrored in the Judeo-Christian tradition, which says essentially there was Genesis, birth of life, and there is an ending. It's time-bound, apocalypse. And this is also backed by Western science, right? That says there was a Big Bang. What happened before the Big Bang? We don't know. But there was a Big Bang, starting point. Life started, and then there may also be an end. And there are different terms for it. There's some people call it the big freeze, the point of equilibrium, when the universe stopped, expanding further. There's a big crunch. It's going to collapse. Right? It's very much a very limited view of what is life. And therefore, disruption means end of life. You get my point, right? Disruption equals death, right, of existence, right? Very apocalyptic view, right? Of course, in India, we have a different notion of time, which is nonlinear and circular, right? And as a matter of fact, right, we have, God, right? The term God essentially is generator, operator, and sustainer, right? Sorry, destroyer, right? So we have Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, right? We don't glorify, too much, disruption because it's part of this loop going on forever, right? As a matter of fact, I don't know if you know this, but at the entrance of CERN, in Switzerland, this giant particle accelerator, there is a Shiva Nataraja statue at the entrance. Because the cosmic dance of Shiva is nothing else than creative disruption. And what they are finding now in quantum physics is that the subatomic level, creative disruption is happening all the time. As we are speaking right now, the whole universe is going to disruption again and again, right? At subatomic level, right? At the particle level. So what the heck are we glorifying here with disruption, right? It's part of existence, right? So having said that, I also want to be, right, a bit lucid and tell you that the reality is that there are going to be, some technologies increasingly that will disrupt the status quo. So if you think about, the reason I started talking about the functional smart and the business smart is this. Functional smart, as you realize, right, is all about execution and repeatability and operational excellence, which is a prime candidate for automation. And this is where, particularly in the industrial sector, robots are going to do it. And by the way, robots, I'm not talking about the robots in factory floor. By 2025, it's estimated that a third or plus of surgeries in hospitals will be done by doctors. I had a big tumor removed 2 years ago. And it was done with, it's called robot knife surgery. The doctor sits there. It's like virtual gaming, He just manipulates certain things virtually, and the robot does it in my body. That's the kind of precision you can get with the robot knife. And this is going to happen more and more. So that kind of, routinized activities across sectors, robots will do it. That's a functional smart. And then the business smart is all about opportunity, right? That's where the smart bots, all the software AI will come in, AI software. For example, you know that more and more banks are using AI as wealth advisors. How to help rich people make more money, right? Well, that's done by AI, not by human advisors, right? So that means that if you're trying to get just more smarter, you are going to be caught in this middle of this, this continuum, right, of smartness, which will be increasingly affected by technology and automation. So you have to go up, right, yourself as a company. This is where it becomes important, right, to say how do we go beyond getting stuck in this plane of smartness and go to another level altogether, which we call, wisdom. And for doing that, I think that we have to acknowledge that the biggest disruption to come for organizations is not technological, despite what Silicon Valley wants you to believe. It's not economical, with all kind of new concepts being thrown around, like sharing economy and whatnot. They are just results of something else, which is a social-cultural disruption coming, which is that the value system and the belief system, and I would now introduce the term, the consciousness of your future employees and customers is evolving very, very rapidly. And first of all, more people now are aware that there is growing inequality in the world. This is not just in America. In Europe, for example, there are 50 million people who live below the poverty line, and it's increasing. That's almost 17% of the population now. And secondly, more young people particularly are extremely conscious about the ecological crisis we are facing. Next door, there is a conference going on, right? Global Parliamentary Group, debating all the MPs of the world, debating how to fight climate change. And you know that the Alps, I just read that, are melting now. And so things are really accelerating. And this simple image, is the same way when we send a man to the space and do a picture of the Earth and this blue marble, right, that launched the ecological movement. This is another slide to remember, because if you were to take all the water on Earth, model it as a square cube, as cubic meters and as a sphere, this is what it looks like. And out of that, you see all the drinkable water for 7 billion people. That's a small droplet. You don't even see it, actually, most of you, right? That's all we have left. And when you have like 10 billion people by 2050, you can see how much pressure we are going to face, especially in India, as you know. This might be a huge problem, right? So ecological awareness is becoming broader and broader now. And this translates, as I said, into a new value system, beginning with consumers now. More and more surveys, studies show that majority of consumers now expect companies to be socially, ecological responsible. They start buying local products. I live in California. Now, for the last 7 years now, I don't buy anything grown outside 50 miles radius of where I live. Of course, that means for me as an Indian, I gave up eating mangoes, coconuts, and bananas, and many good stuff, tropical fruits and stuff like that. But that's a value choice. And the good news is that we grow basmati rice in California as well, so I can have basmati rice grown in California, of course, and fruits and et cetera as well from California. So, but I'm not the only one. We call them the locavores, right? People who actually more and more want to consume locally produced, food. And there's also the movement of urban farming. In Delhi, I know that there are a couple of entrepreneurs promoting it as well, trying to grow food, right, close to where the consumption is taking place. And particularly, as I said, with the Gen Y and Z, they tend to value quality of life over quantity in life. So for example, the fact that 50% of young people prefer to share cars as opposed to owning a car. My generation X, right, owning a car was a status symbol, right? The bigger the car, the shinier the car, I can kind of show off and look better than my neighbor, right, who have a different car. And but the kids, they look at cars as a utility, right, as you know, right? So that means that BlaBlaCar, as you know, a French car sharing service company, is growing like leap and bounds here in India, right? They have 70 million members worldwide already. So car sharing is going to take off, making cars, as an ownership model of car become obsolete. And 2/3 of young people also don't want to work for you. Sorry. They want to become their own boss. They want to become entrepreneurs. It's estimated that the average millennial will have at least 5 different career paths. I repeat, 5 different career paths, not jobs. So they will be like, going to different, trajectories, right, professional trajectories in the lifetime, right? They're not like my generation, right, which is, lifers, we call them, right? Stay for, decades in a company. That's just gone. So retaining talent is going to be a big disruption you'll be facing. And then there is this movement which is starting of course, America is always a good exporter of trends. And this is starting in America, which is why I think we have to pay attention. It has been known and practiced, in India, of course. Gandhi was the epitome of minimalism, right? Frugality, right? Frugal lifestyle, and also known as voluntary simplicity, we call it. People who choose to essentially downshift, we call it, which is, reduce the belongings, lead a more simple, frugal lifestyle. This is the case of Ryan and Josh in the 30s, who left their cushy jobs, hefty salaries, abandoned the big houses, the cars, to go live in Montana, I believe, in America. And they started promoting this concept of minimalism, which is, less is more. How do we live with less? And today they have 20 million followers on social media, 20 million in America alone. Okay? So there's a huge trend starting, right? Young people becoming essentially more conscious. And that's kind of where I want to spend some time. Because the title was about conscious society, right? So I have to kind of touch upon it. So this is a book I'm working on. It has been 2 years in work in progress. It's coming out end of next year, 2018. And I'm really looking at what's really happening is that there's a global awakening happening. And I like to call it the raising human consciousness kind of trend. Human consciousness is evolving, as you know, continuously, and we're entering, I think, a very epochal moment where we are going to see this kind of surge in raise in the human consciousness. And of course, when you say consciousness in the Western concept, once the Western world, they will think that conscious means you're awake, you're not asleep or in a coma, right? But of course, in India, consciousness has a whole different connotation, and there's a whole science of consciousness that we have developed in India based on the chakras, which are the energy centers in our subtle body. And as you know, there are 7 of them. Of course, why I'm presenting that is because I would say that until now, as consumers and employees, and even we'll talk about leaders as well, the drivers, the energy that drove us until now came from the lower 3 chakras, which is all about fear. It's about desires, first sexual desire, and then it's about having more, and then it's about power. So essentially, it's about survival, then it's about ambition, then it's about control. It's not enough that I have 10% more market share. I want to be number 1 in my industry, right? And it's always about benchmarking with others. Interestingly, I remember in Silicon Valley having coffee somewhere in a coffee shop, and I was listening to young people speaking. I mean, to 30-somethings speaking, and one person was saying, I went to this mindfulness, silent retreat for 10 days. It was amazing. And the next person says, oh, you did only 10 days. I did 30 days. Right? So even mindfulness for them is a competitive game. Right? That means we are still stuck in the 3rd chakra. Right? So as long as you're operating from the first 3 chakras, you lead a mode of existence, which I call the having mode, which is all about having. You always need to have more because you're never satisfied, because you feel a void inside that you're trying to fulfill with external stuff, objects, products, or titles, or anything you name. You want to try to fill that void, and therefore you always feel the sense of scarcity. It's never enough. And secondly, it's always about you. You're very self-centered. Dalai Lama often says, and it's scientifically backed today, that the people who use the words I, me, mine, often in their sentences, have more heart attacks than the people who use we, us, ours. Okay? So that's what happens. So there's also a danger of heart attack, right, if you focus on these chakras. Of course, the evolution consciousness happens with the heart chakra, because the anahata, the unstruck sound, this is where you become awakened to what exists beyond your narrow self, the ego. And this is really where compassion is born. Compassion is just the passion to reduce the suffering of others, right? This is where it's born. And then the book I wrote about Jugaad is often criticized, but really Jugaad is ingenuity, which is the 3rd chakra. This is where you discover your true self. We are all born with a unique song that each of us is uniquely qualified to sing. But most of us will die without ever discovering that song. And that's where it resides, right? And then comes the intuition, right, which is the third eye, and then the unity, because ultimately the goal of Indian spirituality is to go for non-duality, right, which is the cornerstone of Vedanta, right, non-duality. So as long as you are here, it's about duality, me versus you. I am black, you're white. I'm man, you are woman, right? I'm European, you are I'm Christian, you are Muslim, right? It's all about division. And as you move up, you try to bring things back together. You start having an integral view of the world. And not only that, but as I said, you start living life in a different mode. This is what I call the being way of life, or living. And at this point, what happens is that you don't crave for things from the outside world because you experience the inner abundance. I'm whole and complete inside. So I don't need anything from the outside to validate me or to complete me. Okay? And secondly, you become more what I call other-centered. It's all about helping others. It's not about satisfying my hunger, but satisfying other people's hunger and alleviate their suffering. And I think that as more citizens become conscious, they're going to build what I call this conscious society, which I think I will be dealing with in my next book. I've been looking at 50 case studies around the world of communities that are building this conscious society, where they're trying to essentially strike this balance between what I call well-having, which is having stuff, because we still need to have food, water, right, basic stuff, but not make it an obsession and the end goal of life, life's pursuit. But balance that with what I call well-being. And the art of well-being, we haven't practiced enough, I think. So, and the consciousness is the bindu, the dot. That's what allows you to find that beautiful balancing act. So it's not too much on the having side or too much on the being side, because too much being as a leader, then you're going to live in the Himalayas, right? We don't want that, right? So you have to be engaged in the world, and at the same time, this is a classic balancing act, right? Between, kama, artha, and dharma and moksha, right? That's a balancing act. So now, let me tell you something more relevant for you, because so far we talked about the consumers becoming more conscious, but what happens if employees become conscious? Here, I think we have to, start questioning some of the interesting, somebody heard about the employee aspirations, right? One of the questions asked earlier, right? I think that the employee aspirations is an interesting term because often we think about needs more than aspirations, right? And the needs, of course, for a long time, we talked about, the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? Which is, all about, my basic needs have to be covered first before I can really think about others. But I would argue that this hierarchical view and linear view of life, it's about life as well, which is in my 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, I work hard, get decent kind of material comfort, and then I set up a foundation, give back in my 60s, right? That model is gone, I think, in coming years. Because instead of climbing a ladder, the young people want to blossom like a flower. Because they are more and more self-aware that they have a gift to offer to the world. And they want to unfold themselves, realize the fullest potential in a receive and give dancing performance with society and with nature. So what it means as HR leaders, I think that you have to become actually meaning makers. I've only 2 more slides, I'm done, sorry. You have to become meaning makers because these kids, I'm telling you, it's amazing. I'm getting like 3, 4 emails every week now. I don't know what's going on in my life itself, coming from teens, 12, 13. And they're saying, I'm in high school and, my parents, want me to go to MIT. I got admitted to MIT. I'm not interested in going to MIT because I think I want to become something else. So they have this amazing now self-awareness of the gifts they are born with. And they feel like the educational system, let alone, the jobs waiting out there, don't help them manifest that, unique expression they have within themselves. So that means that you have to help them find that meaning they're seeking so desperately. And then be a talent gardener, as I said, they're like flowers, right? Because a gardener, that's what they do, right? They don't micromanage the growth of flowers, right? They just make sure that, the soil is well tended, enough sunlight, well watered, and then the flowers blossom themselves. They have this embedded genius within in the seeds to know how to become the fullest beauty right? So that is going to be your job as talent, gardeners. And then finally, you have to deal with, your own leaders in your company. Make sure that, they evolve as well, right? From this smart leadership, which is essentially driven primarily the energies of the first three chakras, to try to connect them more with the energies of the upper chakras. And I would just end my presentation with a blessing, saying Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Why I'm going to say that? Because I don't know many of you know why we say 3 times Om Shanti, 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 which is very powerful. The first Shanti is, may you be protected from threats from the elements. Because in the early Vedic times, elements like air, Vayu, fire, Agni were powerful. So they were really worried about, the force of these elements. So that's why the first Shanti is, may you be safe from, the disruptive aspects of the elements. The second Shanti applies to, may you be safe and protected from violence from other beings. It could be animals, but also other men, right? So the tech disruption and competition we talk about is actually about the second Shanti, right? Maybe peaceful from competition, right? But the third Shanti is a more exciting one as an academic for me. That's about the inner disruption caused by your own mind. Because we have such an advanced brain, right, compared to other, mammals. So a lot of the pain and suffering is on self-help, self-induced, right? So that's why I want to start with that, because the biggest disruption I think is going to happen is that as the environment becomes more and more complex with all the kind of, turbulence, it's going to create more stress. So that's why the inner disruption is what you have to watch out for, something which is essentially self-induced. So that's why I want to close this again with a blessing, Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. I will be here the rest of the day and be delighted to address any questions you may have. Thank you very much. Namaste.